Hello, it's Tom here. We've got a great episode of Last Orders for you today, but before we get into that, I just want to let you know about Spiked's very exciting new daily newsletter. It's called Today on Spiked. Sent out every day at 6 p.m. It gives you your essential roundup of all of the content that we've published that day, along with exclusive commentary from the Spiked team that you won't read elsewhere. And it is also completely 100% free. We're publishing more and more these days, so if you want to make sure that you never miss an article or an essay or a podcast, stop what you're doing right now and go to spiked-online.com/newsletters and sign up to Today on Spiked. Once again, that's spiked-online.com/newsletters and Today on Spiked. Thanks so much, and now on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, Spike's podcast. This is a show all about freedom, the nanny state, censorship, and of course, COVID. Today, we're joined by Geoff Norcott to discuss why the left lost the working class, how lockdown has hammered the pub trade, and why the police have gone woke. Welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater. I'm joined today, as I am every month, by Chris Snowdon, Director of Lifestyle Economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Tom. Hello, everybody.
And we're delighted to be joined today by stand-up comedian and the author of the forthcoming book, Where Did I Go Right? How the Left Lost Me, Geoff Norcott. Geoff, thanks so much for joining us again.
Listen, man, I would be here even if I didn't have a book I desperately needed to flog.
And we appreciate that very much. But let's talk about that book that you desperately need to flog, because the topic that you're taking on there, your journey, if I might call it that, is kind of the story of British politics over the past 10 years. A lot of people who might have traditionally been Labour voters, such as yourself, brought up on a council estate, a trade unionist father, nevertheless finding themselves, if not attracted to the Tories, certainly repelled by the Labour Party. And given we've got a local election looming, this will come out after the results come in, that seems to be a kind of continuing story. So just tell us a little bit about the book and the sort of issues you touch upon there.
Well, I suppose it was the question that people most asked me. And there was a sort of degree of entitlement and a complacency within that question, was how the hell did someone like you end up voting for the Tories? Even if you take out, like you say, the last few years, it's not unheard of, was it? Like working class people voting Conservative. You know, we had Mondeo, man. You know, we had Thatcher had popularity beyond London, you know, in the southeast. So it just seemed, part of the reason I first started talking about my politics in comedy was it just seemed like a ridiculous question. So I thought, why not take on that ridiculous question? And, you know, on a practical level, I wanted to write a memoir, but I'm not that well known. So I sort of thought I had to do something that was a bit more ambitious with it, hopefully, which is to try and provide maybe a worm's eye view of the sort of totemic events of British politics throughout my lifetime. So there are, you know, the 92 election comes up, you know, Blair getting in comes up, the credit crunch. It's all sort of from just a very everyday perspective and the impact that it all had on my politics. I suppose really it's a book about how bias is formed, you know, because as I say very early on, people will read stuff and go, well, that's a bit biased. I'm like, yeah, I am biased. We're all biased. But let's try and work out where it came from. And in doing so, maybe people will resonate and think, yeah, I went on that journey as well. And then maybe if they're interested, and the signs are that they might not be, but maybe people from the left might be interested too. Because I'm certainly not alone. You know, high working class support for the Conservatives has been around for quite a few years now.
And what were some of those events or some of those issues, if you like? Because obviously Brexit looms large in all of this, but there's so much in this. I remember seeing you stand up a few years ago and you were kind of talking about how self-reliance in particular is something which the left seems to have no consciousness of, even though it's something which even the Labour Party, a bit like patriotism, would be a bit more comfortable with than they are now. So what are some of those issues, if you like, which kind of sent you in a different direction?
Well, I mean, there were kind of straws in the wind. I guess one, which is an odd one to quote maybe, but around about the time of the credit crunch, I mean, there was a kind of prevailing narrative, one in comedy, which was just the bankers, eh? The bankers. That was a punchline. And the Tories would eventually become that punchline. But just the bank, did I mention the bankers? And I sort of thought, I'm not sure everyone in this room fully blames the bankers entirely for the credit crunch. And I sort of thought, I kind of hold people who got 125% mortgages a little bit accountable. I mean, I always felt that there should be something about the word 125% mortgage, which is a little bit of a red flag on the play, you know, sort of like enjoyable poetry. If you saw that on a poster, you go, well, this sounds like bollocks. So there were little things about where I started to realise that my politics were changing, which was that where I preferred to hold people accountable as well, because I do think, you know, certainly on a personal level, that is the most inspiring narrative for me, because if I'm accountable, then I can change things, right? But a lot of the victim narratives, and certainly, and this is true, this is pre-Corbyn even, the Miliband was swimming in this area as well, is a lot of this prevailing victim narrative, it sort of robs you of your chance to make a difference. You know, you're just this sad little figure that needs the state to come in and scoop you up. I mean, I remember getting free school meals, and I was quite young, but I was sort of thinking, what we're relying on the state? Even then, it seemed quite a parlous thing. So you know, I've always been quite self-motivated in that respect. And I think, you know, this is something actually Chris said when he was last on my podcast, which is a very good point, about the pitch that Labour made at the 2019 election. Just didn't resonate, which was that all your lives are shit. There's this tiny amount of rich people and everyone else's lives are shit. And you go, well, I think for most people, if you've got your own gaff, right? If you've got a motor, you've got a couple of holidays a year, maybe a couple of nights out a month. A lot of people, that's a good life. You know, we're not all insane that we need to be psychotic billionaires with helicopters and islands. No one really wants that particularly. So the Labour message just continues to be a bit off, particularly in respect to working class voters. And, you know, in terms of the context we're in now and the recent polling for Hartlepool, we're just not that far down the line since this party advocated a second referendum, right? The party that's supposed to be about respecting the least well-off and the least powerful in society. That's the one moment, right? Democracy, when your vote counts exactly the same as everybody else's. They advocated something which did not respect that. And I think that we're still in the slipstream of that, and we will be for a while.
So, Chris, you're our token northerner on this podcast. So I just wanted to get your thoughts on this, really, because Geoff makes an important point there, which is that particularly in the southeast, for a long time, white working class voters in particular, you know, that was associated with being supporters of the Tory party, people who, from the left's view at least, were just sort of paid off by Thatcherism, etc. But I suppose the missing piece, or the big development, certainly since over the last two elections, has been the red wall crumbling in the Midlands and the North. Labour seemed to hope for a while that that would just be a blip, that it was just about Brexit and Corbyn, and once both of them were kind of cleared out of the way, things would go back to normal. But do you think this realignment, if you like, is going to hold for a little bit longer?
I think at least for a little bit longer, yeah. I'm a bit like you. I didn't think it would last much beyond Brexit. I was surprised it happened at all. I'm not a very good political soothsayer, you know, but I didn't see them winning that many seats in 2019. In retrospect, like all things, it kind of looks inevitable. But the reason I didn't think they would win so many seats is there's such a tribal thing about voting Labour, and even more so a tribal thing about never voting Conservative, right, in so many places. And Brexit, I guess, was the thing that broke that. And once you've kind of broken that taboo, if you like, it's not that difficult to carry on doing it, you know? And what people forget about, you know, the red wall, the so-called left behind areas, yes, some of them genuinely are left behind. Some of them are actually pretty nice, and people have got a pretty decent life, you know, very London-centric view. Again, the thing that everywhere sort of north of Watford Gap is whippets and flat caps. But there's huge regions, really, in the Midlands and the North where people can buy a house at a reasonable price. There's plenty of places where house prices are still lower than they were in 2008, in fact, where people have got, you know, 2 cars, 2 jobs, and life is actually pretty good. And people don't care about a few people earning a lot of money. And they don't particularly care about some of the other issues that not just Labour, but a lot of Tory politicians think are the most important thing, like reducing climate change emissions and so on. You know, like most people, they just want to get on in life, not think about politics too much, have a job, have a pay rise, have kids, and whichever party is going to make that easiest for them, they're going to vote for. Which is why, for example, the Conservatives have frozen fuel duty for years and years, despite the fact they keep talking about going net zero. They freeze fuel duty because cars and the price of petrol is a very, very important thing for most people who live outside of London. So a lot of the people who are now voting Tory, they almost certainly did vote Labour under Blair. They may well have voted Labour in 2010 and even 2015. But there is a sense definitely now that things have changed fundamentally, quite possibly, a real drive from the Labour Party. I remember 2015, there was a real sense, wasn't there, the Tories would never get a majority again. Just before that 2015 election, that was the political consensus. Tories will never win a majority again. What are they going to do? And there was a moment that sticks with me in the opposition leaders debate that year. I don't know if you remember it. So there wasn't Cameron there because he was Prime Minister, but it was all the other opposition leaders, including Farage, and it was 6 against 1, basically, because you had Ed Miliband and Caroline Lucas and whoever was leading the Plaid Cymru and Nicola Sturgeon. And at the end of it, they literally hugged. All the lefties hugged. And it just felt like, this is it now. It's 6 against 1. And this is now the consensus in this country. And of course, it was all an illusion. You know, most of these parties were getting a tiny fraction of the vote. The Tories went on and won this surprise majority. So things can and do change, yeah.
I think, an interesting thing to say there is going back about in terms of priorities. When Labour left office in 2010, I think that the personal tax allowance was about 6,200, right? And it's now pretty much double that, right? So people can earn what would have been called low income jobs, whether or not you agree with this from a taxation point of view, whether or not it's a way of the government essentially underwriting businesses. For people, they're seeing a lot more of their money. Council tax rises. Under Labour, it was a non-progressive form of taxation because in the eventual analysis, people on lower incomes were worse off. This happened under a Labour government. And Chris makes a great point about the tribalism. I agree. I didn't expect it to stick. But you've got to remember that the same tribalism that makes you vote one way can also be applied. That level of passion can be applied in reverse. And when you look around and see what certain voters think of Labour now, I don't hold that level of antipathy. People hate Labour. I mean, they're absolutely appalled, and they're starting, in a way, to apply to the political party things that they're not even responsible. They'll probably hold Labour responsible for Sainsbury's taking some wafer-thin woke stance on something. But it all adds up to a proposition of the left that is, quite unappealing for a lot of working class people.
And just before we close this section, what do you make of Keir Starmer, Geoff, in all of this? Because the argument that some people made was that Corbyn was really the only problem. If you had someone semi-sensible, everything would be fine. And yet you've got someone who's, really only defining characteristic is kind of being semi-sensible, and he's making a complete hash of it. So what have you made of his leadership so far and how that's been panning out?
Well, the thing is, I think he's an all right bloke. I think he's an all right politician. I don't think he's a bad person. I certainly don't have some of the reservations about him as a human being that I had about Corbyn. But remember when he first got in and he was cross-examining Johnson at PMQs and people, the sort of social media echo chamber was salivating over the forensic nature, forensic Keir. But again, someone being forensic isn't something you can massively identify with. If you go on a stag do, if that's your stag do nickname is Forensic Keir, right? That just doesn't really, no one wants to hang out with Forensic Keir. I mean, he might be all right at splitting the bill, but beyond that, you take Boris Johnson, a massively flawed human being, but if there's a divide in the stag do, I'm probably going where Boris is going because he's rugby tackling kids Boris. You're like, well, this could be interesting, that is not coming from the sentient bit of my brain, but it's the honest part of me. And I think that it's not unreasonable. The way you respond to leaders is an emotional and instinctive thing. We've had that for ages, people being taller, people having more hair, people not being Welsh. So, the idea that someone as kind of insipid and sort of like latte as Starmer hasn't really built on his early success isn't that surprising.
Brilliant. So the book is Where Did I Go Right? How the Left Lost Me. When is it out, Geoff, and where can people pick it up?
It is out on the 13th of May. I think the people on the woke left would notice that I say How the Left Lost Me, which they would probably call victim blaming. I would call it taking responsibility, but you can get signed copies on Waterstones. You can get the hardback off Amazon, and there's an Audible. People always ask about Audible now, right? Is there an Audible? And they get really angry at even the possibility that there might not be. And then if you say yes, did you read it? Yeah, I did. I mean, I'm not at that level where I could afford somebody to read it for me. But I think within an hour and a half of me talking, they'll be wishing that I did have the money to employ a narrator.
How long does it take to read it?
It was 3 working days, basically. So the first day, the morning I was dying on my arse. Like my voice was constricting. I was just, the scale of the task really got on top of me. And it was a bit like a cricket match, really. It was tough in the morning. The openers were getting hit. And then by the afternoon, the ball got a bit softer. Started knocking it about. Day 2, really started plundering some runs. Yeah, but it's a big undertaking, Chris. I learned tricks along the way, but my God, it really was a surprise. I don't know if you've done one yourself.
Sounds
Jesus
intimidating.
Christ, it's hard going. I mean, I'm not selling it well. If the publishers are listening to this, they're probably fucking fuming.
Last Orders, like all of Spike's podcasts, is free. There are no subscriptions, bonus episodes for paying customers. We want to reach as many people as possible. But to help us do so, we rely on the generosity of our listeners. So if you enjoy the show and have a bit of money to spare, please do consider making a donation. Anything you can give is greatly appreciated. Now, back to the show. So let's move on to our next topic, a kind of permanent topic on this podcast for the past year, but just what's going on with COVID and lockdown. At the moment, we're stuck in this kind of very glacial unlocking of society. Data, not dates, like many government slogans, has been kind of burnt into our heads by this point. But whilst the data's looking really good, day by day, the dates aren't moving an inch. This kind of really hit home over the very wet and blustery bank holiday weekend. We saw images of the few people who did venture out to the pub, huddled under umbrellas as gales were blowing overhead and all the rest of it. So quite an inspiring sight, but also a reminder of how far we've got to go back to normality. Chris, I know that you've said many times on this podcast and elsewhere that you think it's too slow, but is there really any justification whatsoever for going as slow as we are, given how good things look out there, given where the cases are, given the vaccine rollout? I mean, what argument is there for this slow unlocking that we're going through at the moment?
I really don't think there is one now. A month ago, you could have maybe said, well, you just need to get a few more second jabs done, but 15 million or more second jabs now? I can't see any argument for it. And you say data, not dates, have been burnt into our brain. It's not because of the government, if it is, because the government hasn't said that for a long time, because it never meant it. In retrospect, I wish they'd never mentioned any dates, because if they hadn't, then the political pressure to have unlocked, at least let people go inside a pub by now, would have been just overwhelming. There wouldn't have been any serious argument against it, I don't think. So it's a mess. And they're not going to unlock earlier because they don't need to in a way, because there's always another kind of carrot dangling and you go, oh, it's only another 2 weeks for this and it's only another 5 weeks for that and what have you. And I haven't seen the polls recently, but traditionally the polls are hysterically in favour of even harsher lockdown. So I don't suppose we'll get any public support on that. I've just walked past a pub actually with a very large beer garden, big sign saying our beer garden is open, welcome, not a single person on any of the tables. Weather is appalling. People were celebrating last year when carbon emissions fell by 5%. They're not celebrating now, are they? With frostiest April ever. Be careful what you wish for. I mean, it has to be said, we've all been incredibly unlucky with the weather. I've never known a spring as cold as this. It's the 5th of May we're recording this, and there hasn't been a single warm day so far. If it had been like last summer, I don't think it would have mattered as much. People could have been out dining and drinking outside pubs. So that's unfortunate. On the other hand, it's not entirely unexpected you're going to get crap weather in spring in Britain, is it? You can't expect it to be like last year every year. And it's costing the pub industry something like £200 million a week. This is not chicken feed we're talking here. A lot of these pubs, like the one I walked past, I dare say, are losing money opening. So, there isn't a case for it. And obviously you would not start from here. And that's got to be the thing. It's like, if we had cases like this, we were fully open, would we decide to close the indoor hospitality and pubs and all the other things they've closed? Of course they wouldn't. Of course they wouldn't. They're getting away with it because they've got these dates in people's minds.
Geoff, what's your thoughts on all this?
Well, I mean, they committed to a roadmap. A lot of people like the roadmap, left and right, kind of risk averse and slightly more carefree. But they said with a fair wind in our sails, right? And by a fair wind, they meant, not the wind that we've evidently had, but they meant the figures were good, right? So we've had loads of wind. We've been blown along, the oceans by a gale of exactly the wind that they asked for. And they said data, not dates. And so they've kind of boasted so much about their success that I just wonder if it's partly coming from, if we're being charitable, like an emotional place. There was a period last year when perhaps they could have been quicker to act when it seemed clear that there was a different variant. I remember even on like a parochial level, I knew people getting COVID that weren't really leaving the house much. And I was going, I think there might be something else happening here, right? It seemed fairly obvious. They were a bit sluggish there. And I wonder if this is a case of overcorrection. The fear that they must have felt being in office as those numbers racked up has stayed with them. But unfortunately, that's not the way you can really govern or treat the hospitality sector. That is the 5th biggest sector in the country. I mean, just the idea that the Conservatives are supposed to be the business party, the way they've treated the hospitality sector is frankly disgusting. And they've made more investments than any other sector, when we were able to open, about how they could keep it COVID safe. They were very agile and quick to react. And it's just been a slap in the face. And I wonder if it comes from a slightly puritanical base, is that just, hospitality, drinking, it's all a bit frivolous, isn't it? We don't need to drink out or eat out. We don't really need to buy T-shirts, do we really? All retail, we don't need to buy most of the things that we buy other than basic food stuff. So I'd be disappointed if they'd made some sort of moral distinction between retail and hospitality, right? They're both coming from a very similar place. So as Chris says, I don't think it's going to change. And I hope that enough businesses can kind of hang on in there. I mean, if they even try now, because what will happen, we've now got used to 2,000 cases a day. If it's 4,000 cases, people say, well, that's double what it was a week ago, but it's still 4,000 cases, right? So my fear is that we've sort of recalibrated essentially the Overton window of risk. And we may find ourselves in fairly ridiculous sort of intellectual territory going forwards. And you saw that tweet yesterday from the National Education Union, who were saying we're going to fight for face masks to stay beyond May 17th. No scientific evidence as to why that's necessary beyond this point. We're beyond the point where even a teaching union feels that they have to make any sort of reference to any kind of objective evidence. So the challenge from now, bit by bit, is if things stay good, is shrugging off some of the risk-averse and interventionist impulses that we've accrued over this time.
Chris, do you think that pubs have been singled out for punishment over the course of this past year? Because they did become a symbol very early on of all that was kind of wrong and reckless, both with the government at first, but also Brits in general. Why do you need to go to the pub? Why are you so upset? Not recognising, as Geoff was saying, that this is a big industry, also quite important to communities and an industry that had taken a battering before all this anyway. But do you think there was an element of just because the old puritanical public health instincts were towards not trusting people with alcohol in general? Was that a part of why they've been so badly punished, do you think?
Just discouraged the consumption of alcohol in general. Yeah. What do you expect when you have public health people making policy? I was just thinking earlier about what Tier 2 was like. Tier 2 now seems relatively liberal, but you could only go to a pub basically on your own. All right, you could go with your own household, but you're not going to do that. You could go to a pub on your own and you had to order food. And when you finish your food, you had to stop drinking. I mean, and that was like the liberal approach compared to obviously Tier 3 and what we got now. And it was a 10 p.m. curfew, wasn't it? That was an absolute fiasco. I think everyone now accepts that was a really stupid thing to do. Substantial meals, Scotch eggs, everyone leaving at the same time, everyone going around each other's homes. I don't know how many people are going around each other's homes at the moment, but it must be the majority of the population, I would think, have done it at least once, And in that respect, it's great that case numbers are still going down. But yeah, you've got public health people who don't like booze. Someone like Theresa Marteau, do you know her? Professor Theresa Marteau, she's on Sage. Her day job, or what she seems to spend most of her time doing, is researching whether reducing the size of beer and wine glasses makes people drink less. And she has spent God knows how much taxpayers' money doing little experiments in fake pubs, seeing whether you adjust the size of a wine glass, and then recommending in the conclusion that the government needs to regulate the size of wine glasses. These are the kind of cranks that we've got on Sage. The modelers have a lot of responsibility for this roadmap, of course. I mean, I hope there is accountability for them. I'm not a big hater, actually, of Neil Ferguson and his infamous model from last March, which, just showed a huge number of deaths, because I think we could very easily have a huge number of deaths. Maybe not exactly what he said, but it's only a bloody model. Point was, we're going to have a huge number of deaths unless we lock down. But his more recent ones, the ones both from Imperial and from Warwick, which seemed pretty much openly designed to get Boris to slow down the unlocking as much as possible. Everyone could see it was ludicrous. And Ferguson and the other models are now backing away from it. Ferguson now says, I think there's not going to be a third wave. He thinks everything's going to go swimmingly. Well, what's changed then? I mean, what has actually changed? I mean, yeah, the vaccine rollout's been a bit quicker than they expected, but they did like absolute best case scenario, most optimistic scenarios, and it was still 1,000 people dying in the middle of July.
Geoff, I was just wondering, the last time we had you on the podcast was kind of in the before times anyway, so the world was very different. No one had heard about COVID, but how would you mark the government's response to all of this? Because that's a big question now, with elections coming up, etc., is how people feel that they've done now that we're a year into this, now that the vaccine rollout has come. How would you mark their performance in all of this?
Well, I think overall they've had some big wins on the big things, right? Initial messaging, stay at home, protect the NHS, incredibly effective. One of the most effective slogans we've ever had, right? Acted quickly with furlough. You know, if you're going to stop people working, you have to pay them, right? If you're going to legally stop them working. And then they had a spell in the sort of mid-period where there was confused messaging. I personally not, eat out to help out at the time made a lot more sense than people retroactively ascribe to it now. I think PPE, if you're going to criticise them with PPE, you have to give them excessive credit for the vaccine rollout. You can't do one and not the other. And I think towards the back end, it's where I suppose a more right-wing economic model has helped in terms of acquiring vaccines and just getting the right people in, getting them to do things. And I think that people who voted for them at the local elections might simply think that, well, whatever Labour's position was, it was probably only really going to be to lock down quicker and harder, but then which would affect the economy worse. That was the only real alternative. And then you've got to ask yourself whether or not they would have brought in somebody like Kate Bingham to do the job that she did. I think that there might have been quite a turgid approach to the vaccine rollout, probably more risk averse. I don't know how they'd have felt about the original JCVI decision to expand the time between first vaccine and, they'd have probably been a couple of unions kicked off, and then there would have been a few tweets saying I stand shoulder to shoulder with, they're always standing shoulder to shoulder with something when you think it's a fucking tweet. You're not standing shoulder to shoulder with anything. Solidarity with vaccines, So I think at best it would have been overall a very similar outcome in a 5-year period, if you get my drift. Whatever they might have saved in lives in the short term probably would have had an equal negative reaction in the long term. So in that context, I think the Tories come out slightly ahead just because they acted, because they did things. One thing I do think is I find it astonishing that some people kept their jobs. Gavin Williamson, for one, I just cannot understand how that man has a job. I felt the decision to keep hold of Cummings was just the most ridiculous kind of splurge of political capital I've ever seen. But yeah, I think overall, on balance, fractionally ahead.
And Chris, just finally on this subject, how quickly do you think it's going to be before things get back to normal? Because we've been told that the 21st of June is the big reopening, but there are these kind of social distancing and vaccine passport reviews going on in the background. It seems like the early indicators they got from these various pilot schemes, at a festival, a nightclub. I know you were at the Crucible one recently, which is possibly the most on-brand Snowdon thing you could possibly do. I mean, there's been a lot of kind of concern that there's going to be this kind of long tail of mask wearing, social distancing, whatever. But where do you see it going? Do you think, given how good things are, it is just going to unravel quite quickly after the 21st of June, or is it going to be a while yet, do you think?
I'm very optimistic, actually. I should say about the Crucible COVID pilot test, I know it's been reported that there's been no cases. I'm sure that's true because there's hardly any cases anywhere. But at no point was I encouraged, let alone forced, to take a test after going to the Crucible, which was supposed to be quite an important part of it. But anyway, maybe everybody else did.
Can you imagine all those clubbers? That clubbing event in Liverpool? I was thinking, because the tests are saliva tests. I now, knowing what people get up to clubbing, some of them might have had a real difficulty getting enough saliva together to do a lateral flow test. Hang on a minute, mate. You got some Sprite, mate? You got some Sprite? Sorry for butting in.
It goes up your nose, actually, the old lateral flow.
So does most stuff at that event in Liverpool, actually. But
I'm basically very optimistic about it. I mean, Geoff says, what's going to happen if it goes from 2,000 to 4,000? I don't think it will mean anything unless there are hospitalizations attached. And look at Israel. The modelers don't want to look at Israel for some reason, but they're one of the only countries that are ahead of us, and they've had days with no deaths. They've got hardly any cases. I mean, like a few dozen cases a day, and they're completely open, I think, pretty much. There might be a bit of mask wearing going on, but I think that's where we're headed. And it's summer. And, obviously there is a seasonal effect to this in that people, if this weather finally improves, people can be outside. So it's harder to transmit. And by the time you get to autumn, winter, everyone's been jabbed and they're now talking about giving people a booster jab. So I'm very optimistic about it. I don't believe any of the conspiracy theories that, the government wants to keep us wearing masks forever, or the government wants us in lockdown again and again. Of course it doesn't want to make itself needlessly unpopular. And I think the public, although they've been very pro-lockdown, I think that's sort of conditional on them knowing that there is a roadmap and there's light at the end of the tunnel. So I think when we speak, in July, August, I think things will be back to normal. And I would be surprised, although of course it's not impossible with variants, blah, blah, blah. I would be surprised if come winter, this is more of a problem than flu, although there's obviously going to be a lot more chatter and worry about it.
Hi, I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. And if you are, why not take a second to leave us a rating and a review with your podcast provider? It takes just 30 seconds and is a great way to help us reach new people. Now, on with the show. So let's move on to our final topic for the day, which is non-crime hate incidents and the great awakening, if you like, of the British Constabulary more broadly. So in recent weeks, the Home Secretary has clashed with the police, sending this letter ordering them to stop recording these non-crime hate incidents, which have been in the press a fair bit in recent years. We throw around the word Orwellian a lot, but where these things are concerned, I think there's no other word for it. If people haven't heard of these before, it's essentially instances where someone takes offence at something that you've done or said that isn't a crime, but still has to be recorded as such, more or less. Someone can report these things without necessarily even being the victim of it. They don't even necessarily have to be present for when it took place. It could just be something you've tweeted, and yet the police have recorded 120,000 of these things. And just give you some famous examples being Harry Miller, the Humberside businessman who had one recorded against him for retweeting a trans-sceptical limerick. Former Home Secretary Amber Rudd has one to her name because of a speech she made on immigration by an academic, reported her in that instance, and he later admitted that he hadn't actually even heard or read the speech, he just heard about it. So this tells you something about what we're dealing with here. And yet these things can come up on background checks, extended DBS checks, etc. So, Geoff, what do you make of all of this? I mean, this isn't the only part of the concern around the state kind of encroaching on speech and thought, but it is a pretty shocking example of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's one of these, when you're trying to understand where the voters are going and where people might find that the Conservatives are perhaps a more reliable guardian in certain areas, where you can't imagine a Labour politician or anybody left-wing questioning this, despite it seeming like the most obvious point of basic principles of justice you can imagine, right? That you could have something on your record which implies you're involved in one of the things that's most likely to stop you getting a job in the current climate without any investigation and without any conviction. It's just astonishing. It's laughable. And, and it will probably be used in certain quarters to prove that Priti Patel is, hard right Home Secretary. And the public are watching this going, well, if she's hard right, then maybe I'm hard right, because I don't think I or anyone around me should be. And I think another thing that people will be looking into this is the ranking, let alone whether or not anything's been proved, if the ranking of things so far above just a basic assault, but a basic assault with hate. I think when you're being assaulted, it's a pretty awful experience regardless. But the idea that there's a greater burden of proof on a general assault than a hate-based assault, it's outside of what we know of the principles of innocence. I mean, it's amazing that we find ourselves even in the position of having this discussion. Like, you just don't have to, I think, intellectually, you don't really have to defend this. But, this has happened. Conservatives have been in power one way or another for 11 years. We can't completely absolve them of blame. How has this crept along to this point during the period they were at the wheel? So, yeah, if they're kicking back against it now, brilliant, but it feels a bit late.
Chris, what's your thoughts on all this?
Well, as a very hateful person myself, I obviously find it extremely concerning. Admittedly, my hatred is not directed at ethnic minorities or not directed at women exclusively, but that shouldn't really matter if hate's the thing we're trying to oppose. I mean, I certainly don't agree with non-crime, hate crime, whatever it's called. I really call me a traditionalist. I don't think the police should be getting involved in non-crimes. I think there's enough crimes, there's enough things that are illegal at the moment, especially, that they don't really need to be doing that. But I don't even agree with the idea of hate crime, of punishing essentially the same offence differently. Let me give you a sort of a thought experiment, right? A bloke gets assaulted violently and badly in a pub. In one scenario, the victim is Jewish and the perpetrator is attacking because he's Jewish. In a second scenario, the victim has been trying it on with this bloke's wife, and so he gets hit for it. In a third scenario, there's no reason for it at all. It's just a totally unmotivated and random attack. Now, I think most people would agree that the anti-Semitic attack would be morally more objectionable than the one that's based on jealousy. Okay? Just as a kind of intuitive gut feeling. But both of those are hate crimes, they're both motivated by hate. So only one of them would actually be defined as a hate crime, and the perpetrator would get a tougher sentence. But who should really get the tougher sentence? I would say probably the guy who just attacks somebody completely at random, because he's an absolute psychopath. Who should be in prison longest? I would say arguably the utter nutcase who could do anything, But ultimately, I think you should treat them all the same, probably, and that would apply to any other crime. So, yeah, I mean, you can have more of a serious debate about that. I don't think there's any serious debate about non-crime verbal hate speech or whatever it is. It should never be investigated by the police. It shouldn't be kept on people's files. It shouldn't be even investigated, because it's just saying hurty things at worst, as far as I can see.
And one of the strange things about it is that it seems to be, in many ways, a creation of the police themselves. I might be wrong in this, but I don't think there was any specific law that was changed that this stems from. The police have said that this is basically them just trying to implement the recommendations of the Stephen Lawrence report or something. That's kind of how they justify it. But it all comes back to a College of Policing manual that they've had for a number of years. But you do see this, Geoff, where the police seem to have really embraced this kind of hurty feelings policing, if you like. Not only are they going around investigating these things, but, we saw that story recently, or I think it's in the Wirral somewhere, where they showed up outside a shopping centre with a big sign on the back of a truck talking about people should come forward and report instances in which they've been offended and all the rest of it. There's been a lot of talk about how the kind of woke left have captured all kinds of different institutions in society, whether it's in the arts or the BBC or whatever, but no one really expected that this would trickle down to the police, did they? Like, what should we make of this in particular?
Well, I think it's the same, with a lot of corporations and politicians in a way, is that they aren't on the kind of front line of public opinion in a way. The only way that they are is in social media, and it scares them. It scares them of trending. It scares them of being accused for things. So it's a risk-averse reaction, which is, I don't want my name to be in the public eye, so I will solve this thing here, and I'll also solve this simple crime here. Whereas the real crimes that general members of the public get solved, they're not able to do that. And partly because the way that police are allowed to police is also being clipped and managed. And, there are physical restraints on what they can do and when. So this becomes like one of the only things where they can get a win, and they feel good because there are certain communities online which will laud them for that. But for the most members of the general public, brilliant. If you want to break dance at Notting Hill Carnival, fantastic. But it'd be great if you could do that and solve traditional crimes of, like you say, I got an unprovoked assault 2 years ago. I rang the police, didn't want to fucking know. Just didn't want to know. Oh, they're like, well, it's two blokes in a park. Like, they were sort of making a moral judgment on me. Was he the same age as you? Well, it's just two blokes fighting in a park. I was like, okay. So the fact that the police are morally ranking crimes is quite a disturbing development. And ultimately, it's democratic. Where is the mandate for them to do stuff like that? Because it certainly didn't come, in any manifesto. And I just think that maybe they employ people to manage social media. They're scared of being that name on social media, and it encourages them to overcorrect and make drastic decisions which are woefully out of touch.
Brilliant. Well, Geoff, thank you very much for joining us. So, yes, people should go and check out the book, but also, is there any tour dates you've got coming up? I know that things are starting to open.
Well, so the good news is I'm a small to medium-sized touring act, and I could easily have been an arena size, but I think that they might still have issues with mass events by then. So this is where this comes into its own. It's called I Blame the Parents. It's on the road from September. I'm going to be in Northampton, Barnstaple, Leeds, Milton Keynes, all these places. And the show is obviously, I kept thinking, I'm not going to talk about politics this time. And then I think, I've got to. I always will. So in the first half, that'll be about politics. And then the second half is about, I suppose, blaming the parents is a small c conservative sentiment, but I think it's one of those ones that cuts across the political divide. We've all said it, well, I blame the parents. It's one of those judgy little things. That old-fashioned thing of judging people for their actions. I am a judgy bastard myself. I want to get some of those off my chest, and also just talk a bit about my insane parents, which people, hopefully the book might have whetted their appetite to hear more stories from there.
Brilliant. So everyone should go out, get the book, get tickets to Geoff's show, and thanks so much for joining us, Geoff.
Cheers.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to give us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to help support Spiked to keep us making this podcast and all our other podcasts, as well as our daily articles and essays, then please do consider making a donation. It's really easy to do. Just go to spiked-online.com and hit that big red donate button in the top right corner. Anything you can spare is greatly appreciated.